My name is Chris Bizzuto. I'm the Assistant City Manager for the City of Springboro. I am also the Chairperson for the Warren County Chamber Alliance. So welcome to everybody to Miami Valley Gaming. So again, welcome. This is the Warren County Chamber Alliance's 4th annual Economic Outlook Breakfast. The Warren County Chamber Alliance, if you're not aware, is made up of the Springboro, Franklin, Lebanon, Waynesville, and Little Miami chambers. So for the past few years, we've been working together on different collaborative efforts, such as this Economic Outlook Breakfast. We've also put together the Warren County Fly-In to D.C., which is happening next week, actually. So there's about 50 people from Warren County going to that. And we've also put together the Capital Drive that has been happening the last few years, where we go up to Columbus to talk about different Warren County issues. So it's been a great collaborative effort. And again, this Economic Outlook Breakfast is one of those results from our working together, all the chambers working together in Warren County. So first of all, we wouldn't be able to put on this breakfast without our sponsors, so we'd like to thank them real quick. Sinclair Community College, Premier Health Atrium Medical Center, Bricker & Eckler, Miller Valentine, Fifth Third Bank, Conger Construction, Marquise Rental and Staging, Miami Valley Gaming, Minuteman Press, the Warren County Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Warren County Port Authority, and of course the Warren County Chamber Alliance, which I mentioned before. Real quick before we start, I'd like to special thanks to the subcommittee of the Warren County Chamber Alliance who actually put this event together. They did a great job working tirelessly. Those people are Peggy Deregulation from the Franklin Chamber, Carol Hughes from the Springboro Chamber, Don Schroeder from the Waynesville Chamber, and Matt Schnipke from the Warren County Economic Development Office. So I'd like to give them a round of applause for, for doing that. And now on to our main speaker. This gentleman was brought to us by Mike Lee. Mike Lee is a branch manager of the Springboro Fifth Third Bank up in our area, and he used to be past president of the Springboro Chamber. I was teasing Mike that Mike is never wrong, so we know that our speaker is going to be great today. So he said he was a good guy to listen to, so I think we're in for a treat. Our speaker, Jeffrey Kurzenik, is a chief investment strategist for Fifth Third Bank, where he is responsible for the bank's overall client investment strategy. A 29-year industry veteran, Jeff is a frequent guest on CNBC and Bloomberg Television. His writings on economics and public policy have been published in the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, Forbes, and other periodicals. He has been quoted in major industry publications including Barron's, the Wall Street Journal, and Business Week. Jeff earned both a bachelor's degree in economics and a certificate of proficiency in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. Please help me welcome Jeffrey Kurzenik.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be a very bad storyteller today, and I'm going to start with the end of the story, which is where we see the economy of this year and for the next couple of years. And we really start out at Fifth Third. We are looking for an acceleration of growth, no longer quite the doldrums that we've been in this entire economic expansion. We think that this comes in many ways with a much better global backdrop that we can enjoy, which takes a lot of the risks out of the U.S. economy as well, which is helpful both for businesses and investors, as well as helps us accelerate our growth. But if we're going to start talking about the kinds of normal, what we once associated with normal growth, towards 3%, our projection for U.S. GDP this year is in the 2.5% to 3% area. If you're going to talk about that kind of normal growth, you also have to talk about what we would consider more normal interest rates, which means higher interest rates. And then finally, we have to, at this point, start talking about what are the impediments to growth, because we think as we get later and later into the U.S. economic expansion, these impediments to growth will start to dominate the headlines and become much more visible and ultimately bring about the end of this economic expansion. Not yet. And then we'll talk about some of the implications this has. Let me start out by diving into labor force dynamics and where this puts us in the economic expansion. We think that we're in the 7th inning of our current economic cycle. So what does the 7th inning mean? Well, living in Chicago, the Cubs taught me that the seventh inning is a long, long way from the end of the game, or can be. There's no natural calendar for any economic cycle. Nothing says that when you're in the seventh inning that innings 8 and 9 and perhaps extra innings can't play out over a long period of time. If you look at countries like Australia, they haven't seen a recession for decades. So there's no natural end date for a cycle. That being said, when you're in the seventh inning, you start to see the end of the game and you start to be concerned about the forces that could bring about the end of the business cycle. And that's where we are today. But for now, we, at least on the surface, appear to have some of the dynamics that have taken us from 2009 to the present. Most of what has lifted the US economy, albeit at this slow pace, has revolved around the labor markets and revolved around consumers. 70% of US GDP is attributable to household consumption. So what happens in the job markets is very important. The chart on the left shows you monthly changes in payrolls, net changes in payrolls in the US economy. And this is a 10-year chart. Most of these will be 10-year charts. And you can see that deep dive on the left was our truly terrible recession in 08-09, when we were losing 600, 700,000 jobs and more in a given month. And then as you move in time, moving to the right still in that left-hand chart, you'll see that we had a faltering recovery. It looked like 2010. You see that big spike up. That was temporary hiring of census workers. They got hired and then they got let go. But for the last couple of years, we've had pretty consistent job growth. Not spectacular job growth compared to past cycles, but solid job growth. And when you're giving people who didn't have paychecks a paycheck, they go out and spend that paycheck. We have a growing labor force spending paychecks. That continues to drive the US economy forward, although not at a particularly spectacular pace. That's 1.5% to 2% GDP growth rates that's characterized this particular expansion. So this would seem to be more of the same. But we have to observe that sooner or later you start to talk about running out of labor. And this is where we are finding ourselves today, increasingly observing that labor is getting harder to find. And the chart on the right shows you two measures of unemployment in the US. Again, a 10-year chart. You can see on the left-hand side that big rise was the recession when unemployment rates went up. The line on the bottom is what's called the headline rate of unemployment. That's the one that makes all the press. It's currently 4.5%. But there's another measure of unemployment, sometimes referred to as the underemployment rate. Those who are unemployed adds in those who are part-time workers who would like to be full-time workers. And it also adds in what are sometimes called discouraged workers. Those are workers who consider themselves in the labor force but have looked for a job within the last year but are not currently looking for it. And that's been a reservoir we can draw on, bring people who have been underemployed in. But you'll see that both measures have been falling, as you would expect with the expansion. And we're now getting to the point where we have to talk about full employment or tight labor markets. And these are going to be very, very large impediments to growth in the next year to 2 years, in these final innings of the economic expansion. For now, in many ways, we see ourselves as in the sweet spot of the labor markets. And this is very good news for the economy. It's one of the reasons we believe US economic growth will accelerate. Because in addition to this steady rate of job creation that continues, labor markets are now getting tight enough that the 150-odd million employees who already are working in the workforce are starting to get raises. The chart on the left shows you demand for jobs, job openings. They're staying up near record levels. Chart on the right shows you wage growth. And you can see that once the recovery started, there was very, very limited wage growth, and it's just started to accelerate a little bit. We see this acceleration as continuing. This is typically how economic expansions end. Labor markets get tight enough that wage growth gets high enough that it spreads to broader inflation. Not just wage inflation, ultimately spreads to broad inflation. Interest rates go up, either driven by market forces or driven by our central bank the Federal Reserve, and that slows the rate of expansion and ultimately causes the next recession. But that's all in the future. We're not there yet, but this is what we're watching for. Wage inflation is around 3.5%. There are a number of different measures of it. The one we prefer is the one we illustrate here. This is from the Atlanta Fed. They take the median rate of wage inflation. Same number of workers getting lower raises as getting higher raises. We think it's the best measure because it takes out some of the distortions that are going on in the labor force today. You may hear headline numbers. They talk about 2.7% average hourly earnings. The problem we have with that measure is that that includes baby boomers who are retiring, who are typically your highest paid workers, and you're bringing in instead 25 and 26-year-olds who are your lowest paid workers. So your aggregate numbers don't look that great. We think this median number shows you really what's going on. Wages are moving up in the economy. That for now is a very good thing because it empowers consumers. You get paid more for the same hours of work. It gives you more disposable income, and you spend it. And again, 70% of US GDP is attributable to consumption. So this is our primary driver why even before the election we started to talk about a better growth year ahead in the US economy. But now we also have to talk about the change of administration and what that means in terms of prospective and current policies that we think are generally categorized as pro-growth. This is where I have to step back for a moment and give one caveat. And that caveat is when we talk about the impact of policy, it's from the standpoint of economics and what drives financial markets. We have two perspectives. One is the perspective of a citizen. As citizens, we have to look at policy and say, what's the kind of world we want for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and we have a very, very long-term time frame. But as investors, we recognize that markets are myopic. They only look out maybe 3 to 5 years, and they are only concerned with the bottom line. So when I talk about the impact of policy, it's strictly through that lens. We all have to decide for ourselves what we think of these as policies as citizens, but I'm going to be speaking strictly in this morning and in this presentation strictly from the standpoint of markets. Did I do that dance okay? Okay. So what do we think from that perspective? Well, the president has enumerated several policies. We think that the three that we think are most important and going to be most impactful over this 3-year myopia that the markets have will be number one, deregulation. And we'll talk a little bit more. I'm going to focus in on that. Number two, tax reform. And number three, infrastructure spending. There are risks, obviously. One of the risks that's been focused on probably by the national media is this kind of execution risk. Can the president accomplish this agenda? One of the reasons we place deregulation at the top of our list is because so much of it can be accomplished without relying on Congress and without making legislative changes, simply through executive orders and controlling the executive branch and their interpretation, various government agencies' interpretation of rules and regulations. That is already a done deal. Tax reform, we'll see. Obviously, the president has laid out a fairly aggressive tax reform agenda that we would characterize as very pro-growth. There's a lot of devil is in the details here when we see what deductions are taken away. Talk more about that. Some of the risks that we have worried about seem to be fading. Those would relate to, if you listened to the inauguration speech, this America First agenda and risks trade wars. Now, the president, as you know, put tariffs on Canadian lumber. There's examination of foreign imports of aluminum going on, but we don't see anything that rises to the level of a full-out trade war, which we would think would be a major risk. It's something we have to keep an eye on as well. And then there's always these things that you can't predict, the foreign policy crisis. But we would argue that there are very few real crises that can cause enough of a global problem that it slows U.S. growth. I'm going to focus on deregulation because that's what we've already seen through the president's executive orders. We also believe that economists appreciate and underestimate the importance of deregulation. Why? Well, for one, it's really hard to measure. It's hard to model. Economists like things that are easy to model. You can input data and into a formula, and you come out with an output. Deregulation is really hard to do that with, because so much of it depends on the business environment where you implement it. And the biggest problem of all, I think, is that we've seen so little of it. How do you measure the burdens of regulation? Well, our proxy for this is the chart on the left. This is the number of pages in the Federal Register. This is the codification of all the rules and regulations that implement legislation. And that chart goes back to 1940. You might detect a trend. More and more and more. In fact, since 1940, we actually only have the data back to 1936. In that entire data set, 1936 to roughly today, we only have 2 periods of any significant deregulation in the US economy. The first is immediately following World War II, the unwinding of wage and price controls. You might remember we had roughly a 2-decade boom after that. And then in the early years of the Reagan administration, you might remember we had roughly a 2-decade boom following that. Now, this is not to say there's definitely causation, but we think that there's a lot to be said for deregulation, but we don't have much experience with it. It's interesting, President Trump, through one of his executive orders, actually took a page out of the Reagan playbook. One of his early executive orders to all the federal agencies was that if you're going to put out a new regulation, you have to take away 2 old ones. And that's one of the reasons that in the Reagan administration you saw a very successful rollback of regulatory burdens. We think there are a number of benefits here, even though economists don't talk about it enough. There's, of course, the immediate benefit. I'm sure this room is filled with business owners. You've felt these burdens. These burdens are not just on your time, which is important. It's not just on expenses and the bottom line, which is important, but it's also on productivity. So all these things have been tremendous burdens of regulation. This is, again, to emphasize, this is not to say regulation is good or bad. It's simply to note the economic costs. We happen to believe that one of the most important benefits of deregulation is how it makes business owners feel. It's part and parcel of a more pro-business environment. Now, how business owners feel and business confidence turns out is very important. Now, I have to contrast this to what you hear in the press most times is not business confidence. You will hear that, but you hear about consumer confidence. There's actually 2 prime measures. So every other week there's an announcement of consumer confidence, either through Business Roundtable or through the University of Michigan's survey, and you hear about it all the time. But it turns out that consumer confidence is actually not that important or not that impactful. Here's how it works in the United States. If we feel good, if we have high levels of confidence, we go out and spend. Kind of makes sense. If we feel bad, except at the very extremes, we go out and spend. But we call it shopping therapy. It just doesn't matter. People will say, I don't feel good about the economy, and they still spend. Until you get to the depths of a recession, but it has no predictive power. But business confidence is different. The chart on the right illustrates that difference. It shows a measure of CEO confidence. This is from the Business Roundtable. That's the line in blue. And it shows how that impacts or how that relates to CapEx, investment in the future, capital expenditures. And that's the line in green, shown 6 months later. Business confidence, CEO confidence goes down. 6 months later, CapEx, investment in the future, goes down. CEO business confidence goes up. 6 months later, you see more business spending and investment for the future. It's really, really important. We believe that the deregulation emphasis of the current administration is having a profound impact on business confidence. Immediately following the election, we saw the National Federation of Independent Business, the NFIB, survey of businesses, business confidence shot through the roof. Dramatic spike up. We believe this will ultimately lead towards CapEx. Now, the problem here, and you may have heard this debate in the financial press, is things like surveys are generally referred to as soft data. Actual capital investment would be referred to as hard data. There's a 6 to 8 month lag. So we've had the raise in confidence. It's too early to see the data. So the markets and many of our peers have been wrestling with this. We strongly believe it's coming. Some of you may have seen the New York Times sent a reporter to shadow one of my meetings with CEOs up in Toledo. And the reporter described this meeting with 11 CEOs as being like a group therapy session. They were so relieved and so happy and so confident about the future. Even those who did not like the president, who did not vote for the president, they felt very strongly, and they talked about how this was impacting their CapEx plans. Incidentally, that came out on a Monday. On Friday, the president tweeted a link to this article. We believe it was the first time the president has tweeted about the New York Times without referring to it as the failing New York Times and without the hashtag fake news. So we're building bridges at Fifth Third and very proud of that. But I will share with you, this was the first meeting with, we do these CEO roundtables in select markets. This was the first of these CEO roundtables that I had led after the election and after the inauguration. Even I was shocked by how impactful the lessening of regulatory burdens and the prospective changes and the signals that the administration has sent to be a more pro-business administration. It is going to drive, in our opinion, capital expenditures. And capital expenditures have numerous benefits. First of all, it's immediately additive to GDP. A company goes out and buys $1 million of new equipment, that's $1 million more in GDP. But that equipment raises productivity over time. And so not only do you get the immediate additive impact, you get an ongoing benefit through higher productivity. And if there is anything that this entire recovery cycle has been missing, it's been capital expenditures and productivity. Our capital stock in the US, if you look at how aged it is, you have to go back to the aftermath of the Great Depression to find equivalently old equipment and old facilities. That's been a drag on productivity. Last year we had, at one point, 3 consecutive quarters of declining productivity in the United States. That is almost un-American. It's been the only time in post-World War II history, modern economic history, that we've seen 3 consecutive quarters decline. It's a result of our starving capital expenditures. We believe that starvation is about to be over, and this will be extremely important to US GDP. It could be aided by tax reform. Obviously, the president just launched the outline of tax reform yesterday. Many of you know our corporate tax code is antiquated and really doesn't work in a global economy. Among developed countries, we have the highest marginal corporate tax rate in the developed world. It's extremely uncompetitive. It's close to double the average of the 20 largest economies, and it's close to triple the lowest corporate tax rate, which is Ireland. It's just not competitive. This could be coupled and will likely be coupled with some kind of repatriation rate, so companies that have been holding earnings overseas and not reinvesting them in the US, because to do so would incur US taxation, are going to likely, in the tax reform, will get some kind of deemed repatriation where they'll pay a very low tax rate on that and then are free to bring it back without penalty after that. That might finance some of the capital expenditure. It's going to be very important, as will getting a lower marginal corporate tax rate. We don't think the president will achieve all his aims. We would guess that this is an opening shot, talked about a 15% marginal tax rate. It'll probably come out somewhere in the 20 to 25% range. There is a cost to that. We'll see if the administration plans to do this in a revenue-neutral fashion. This is one of the reasons why trying to fix the Affordable Care Act and reduce the cost of that could give greater flexibility. But it is easier to pass through Congress if it's done on a revenue-neutral basis. You don't need any kind of supermajority to do that. You can just use the existing Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. But if you are going to talk about lowering marginal rates and doing it on a revenue-neutral basis, and you're also talking about things like expensing CapEx instead of depreciating it over long periods of time, you've got to give up something else. And the big give up that's available is the interest expense deduction. So we think at the corporate level there will be some sort of give up, and it is most likely going to revolve around the loss going forward of deductibility of interest expense. It is likely that that will be existing debt. The deductibility of existing debt will be grandfathered in, so no need to panic. Might have some interesting implications if you are already committed to adding debt in your businesses, and it's a matter of timing. You might take this into consideration. Again, nothing's written in stone, nothing is passed, nothing formal even is out there for us to look at, but these seems to be our Washington policy resources. At Fifth Third, we obviously do our own work. We have our proprietary research team, but we also spend a few $1 million a year cherry picking the best research that's out there. Our Washington, we have a couple of Washington analysts we rely on. Our favorite at this period in time is a fellow works for a firm called Strategas. He used to be the economist for Americans for Tax Reform and a former tax lobbyist. We think he's got the pulse on it. This is his guidance, but we'll see what comes out. It's a little early to talk about the impact of it, but anything done with our terrible corporate tax code would be a move forward in our view. On the personal income tax side, we don't think the changes that have been outlined by the president are that dramatic from a macroeconomic standpoint, though he emphasized, or his team emphasized, tax simplification at the individual level, and that would be certainly a benefit, and we'd almost view it as a productivity item. I didn't mention infrastructure. I do tend to overlook infrastructure simply because we don't think it's going to be that impactful. It will be very impactful for certain industries, to be sure, certain geographies, but on a macroeconomic level, infrastructure spending is really hard to pull off in a way that enhances GDP growth. It is particularly hard to pull off when you are close to full employment in the US economy. Where are the workers going to come from? We've never tried a big infrastructure spend at a period of full employment. So just to think about it, most infrastructure projects, and we need updated, upgraded infrastructure in the US. I do 120 to 130 flights a year for Fifth Third. I would tell you our major airports in particular, you look at, say, a LaGuardia or an LAX, are just absolutely disasters. But so many of these infrastructure projects aren't federal projects, they're state and local projects. And the federal government, I think we saw in 2009, 2010, really has great difficulty putting money to work in a efficient fashion. And we don't think that the current administration would be any exception to that rule. There are ways to do it more effectively, pushing that money to state and local authorities, and that I think can be effective, but not at this point in the economic cycle. Most of the projects that we would think of as infrastructure are construction related. There is not a construction site in America today that is not begging for workers. So if you have federal projects, construction projects, they are likely to come at the expense of taking workers off of private projects. So even if these are very worthwhile projects, they're not terribly additive to GDP. You're just taking from one hand and giving to the other. And there's also, I think, that very real question of which is more likely to have a productive outcome, a public project or private. I think that's a project by project basis, but I think it's a legitimate question to ask. So we don't focus much on infrastructure. We also think the numbers that the president has thrown out are probably not, are just opening bids. That's his style. So when the president says $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, I spent about a third of my career in New York City. $1 trillion in New York real estate developer east, which the president speaks fluently, just means lots, right? Yeah, it just means lots. So that's where we are. But fortunately, even though things like that may not be as productive, even though it may be long and drawn out to get tax reform, and that may be less impactful than the numbers being thrown out today. And even though deregulation is going forward, but all this comes against a much, much friendlier global backdrop. One of our favorite measures of the health of any economy, the US and global economies, is to look at what's going on in manufacturing. Manufacturing, particularly in developed economies, is not the big gorilla, right? It's particularly important for states and localities that rely on it more, like Ohio and much of the Midwest and the Southeast. But on a national level, manufacturing only accounts for 12% of GDP. But it's the 12% that is the big swing factor and drives other aspects of the economy. So when manufacturing is on an upswing, it tends to lift up the rest of the services-oriented economy with it. And it's certainly more volatile. So we watch that very closely. Our favorite measure there, if I had to pick one of the many measures, are these purchasing manager surveys. It's a couple of outfits, the Institute of Supply Management in the US, Markit, MARKIT globally, and they do these surveys of purchasing managers in manufacturing. And they essentially ask, along a variety of metrics, the question is, are things better this month than they have been in the preceding months? So a neutral level on this kind of survey is 50. That's where half say better, half say worse. And of course, you never have everything going in the right way. But anything above 50 in these measures is associated with economic expansions. Anything below 50 is associated with contractions. Take a look at the charts here. These are various country PMIs, purchasing manager indices, you'll see that heavy dashed line at the 50% mark. That's your neutral point. You can see that since the summer of last year, everyone is doing better and accelerating. Look at even Japan. That's the bright blue line. Even Japan is contributing to global growth. Probably the first time they'll contribute meaningfully in a quarter of a century. And the global composite, which is the green line, the dark green line, is pretty solid. And of course, the US is doing extremely well. This bodes very, very, very well for global growth in the year ahead. And this will be, in many ways, the first time we've been able to talk about coordinated, synchronized global growth in roughly since 2012. Even in the emerging markets, which have generally been viewed as the engine of growth for the global economy, we're seeing a better picture. Economists like to talk about the BRIC nations or the BRICS nations, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some add South Africa to that. And for many years, these really pulled the developed world economies along. But in the last couple of years, we've have had challenges. In particular, Brazil and Russia have been in very, very deep recessions. Recessions in emerging markets not only take away from global growth, but they're very troubling and they raise all sorts of risks, because when we have a recession here, it's just a recession. When recessions happen and deep recessions happen in emerging countries, they can be destabilizing politically. We know that many of these countries associated domestic political risk and stability with recessions. In Brazil, they ended up impeaching the president. That was actually a turnaround point for their economy. In Russia, in addition to assassinations of leading opposition leaders, Russia and Brazil were both faced with what we would think of as stagflation, both bad economic growth or recessions, as well as high levels of inflation. And this is what makes it such a domestic political risk. People are really having hard times. We know Russia recognized this risk because of all their prices going up because of this inflation and the falling ruble. They chose to freeze the price of one item, vodka. If you can't keep them happy, keep them drunk. A time-honored Russian tradition. But all this has turned around, and we see Russia on the back of stronger oil prices has gone back to being a more successful kleptocracy, and their economy is growing again. Brazil should be out of their recession by this year. South Africa is in a little tougher spot, but even they are according to these World Bank numbers, should continue to grow. Meanwhile, you have countries like India, second most populous country on earth, really starting to hit its stride. They're the only one of the BRICS nations that's actually growing faster than they were 10 or 15 years ago. It's on the backs of deregulation. Deregulation works abroad as well as at home. China will be interesting. They have stabilized their economy. It's actually starting to accelerate. All those doom and gloom stories that you've been hearing for years, they're still doing some of those things, but they've also got a lot of money to cushion it, and their economy, particularly their domestic economy, is really growing at a pretty good clip. There will be a day of reckoning there. They really need to continue on the deregulation path that they've been on in a very halting fashion. We think some of what's going on in China is just patching things together to this fall. This fall will be the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China. This is an every 5-year event where roughly the top 400 leaders are chosen or can be up for re-election. Just because of the vagaries of the demographics, this will be the greatest turnover in Chinese leadership, below the very top level, the greatest turnover since the late 40s, early 50s. So it's a big deal for current top leadership in China to get their team in place. Their team would be a more reform-oriented team. So we actually think China could pick up again on its deregulatory path. But for now, they're patching it together to make sure there's no blow-ups economically before this Congress. So we'll be watching that. But the takeaway here is even the emerging markets are looking pretty good and will be major contributors to global growth and hence support U.S. growth. One of the things we've also been encouraged by is the way that the markets have gotten used to the crisis du jour. Right? If you were to watch the financial media, CNBC and whatnot, you would have, except when I'm on, you would have this sense of sort of constant crisis, right? There's always something that is leading the news. You may remember back when we had print media in the United States, if it bleeds, it leads, right? What is the headline? It's always got to be something about death, destruction, doom. And the online media and the financial TV have really picked up this theme. So all you hear about is the potential disaster. One of the people I really look up to in the industry is a fellow, he's in his early 90s, now Byron Wien. He used to be the chief global investment strategist for Morgan Stanley many decades ago. And he has a great saying that I've adopted, but give full credit to him: crises have a way of not happening. If you can see it coming, you don't have to worry about it that much. Well, we think the markets have started to accept that. And what we did is we looked back, got some data on how different crises that we have lived through during this economic cycle, how long it took the markets to recover. And you can see there's a progression. The farthest crisis, the Lehman default, took a long time for the markets to recover, but with every succeeding crisis, it just seemed to have less impact. When we got to Brexit, it was no big deal. When we got to the president being elected, you may remember the New York Times columnist and Nobel laureate economist Paul Krugman was asked, if Trump is elected, how long will it take the markets to recover? Never. I think today we'll make new highs in the S&P 500. We did in the NASDAQ yesterday. So besides the lesson, of course, lesson number one, of course, is markets are becoming increasingly immune to this kind of disaster, doom and gloom talk. And lesson number two, of course, is don't trust economists. So we think this is also helpful. In Europe, of course, we had the French election. We got through that. There's probably will be a Catalan independence referendum in Spain later this year. The Scottish are trying to do another Scottish independence referendum. The markets have gotten so used to those. In the industry, we refer to all these political upheavals in Europe now as the never-endum. And fortunately, we think they're not going to have a lot of market impact. But all this sets us up for a much better growth environment, not just in the US, but globally. And if we're talking better growth environment, we have to talk about higher interest rates. We've seen that adjustment already in many ways in the 10-year Treasury yield. That's the chart on the left. That's the benchmark long-term interest rate, the US economy. Following the election, we saw a big run-up, and frankly, from the end of the summer up into early this year, 10-year Treasury yields went up sharply. And there is a natural tendency when bond yields go up, investors, particularly institutional investors, tend to be drawn to them, and there's always this counter-trend move. Yields go up, people come in and buy, and yields go down a little. We think most of that counter-trend move is over, and we would argue that even though yields have come up quite a long way, there's more room for them to go. The chart on the right is our measure of fair value, illustrates our measure of fair value for bond yields. I wish this were a really complicated formula. Maybe we could patent it or call it the Fifth Third index, but it's really just a 4-year moving average of nominal GDP, real growth plus inflation on a 4-year moving average. That's that blue line that you see on the right. The green line is the yield of the 10-year Treasury. It's not predictive in any given year, but it gives you a sense where things will go over the long term. And our 4-year moving average, our measure of fair value of where bond yields would be fairly valued, is just over 3.5%, 3.53%. But it's moving ever higher. We're growing, even today, growing around 2%. We think it'll be more like 2.5%, 3%. And you add into that inflation of 2 to 2.5%, and we think moving higher. Well, that means that that moving average is going to start incorporating not numbers of 3 or 4%, but numbers of 5%. That blue line, our fair value line, is moving higher. We think eventually, whether this year or succeeding years, interest rates are going to follow. We think this is going to be supported by the Fed's view of how quickly they should raise interest rates. This is what's called the Fed's dot plot. It's where the governors of the Federal Reserve Board, even non-voting governors, think that short-term interest rates, the rates they control, should be. We do expect that the Fed will actually be right this year. They've been predicting a path of hiking short-term interest rates higher for several years. They have been consistently overestimating their ability to do so. But we think just like a broken clock is right twice a day, they'll be right this year. Probably shouldn't say that about my regulator. But that being said, so if you don't see me next year, you'll know why. That being said, we do think we're in for 2 more interest rate increases this year. We think this is actually pretty restrained for the Fed. One of the reasons that the Fed is keeping rates so low is because we believe they're operating on a theory of how labor markets respond that has worked in the past. And that revolves around the concept of labor force participation rates. This is a long-term chart going back to 1949 of the percentage of adults in the US who are in the labor force, either employed or actively looking for employment. Much of this was driven by demographics. You see that big rise up in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. That was the entrance of women into the labor force. This was the secret sauce for fast US growth in the 80s and 90s. We had an increasing percentage of people in the labor force. That is always associated with faster rates of growth because you have a greater percentage of your population working. It also was associated with the baby boomers really coming of age and coming to the point in their economic life cycle where they gain in productivity. It was great news for the US economy. That's what drove those 4% type growth rates. We don't believe we can replicate growth quite that fast because we don't have the demographics. What's been happening since 2000? A big impact has been baby boomers leaving the workforce. People tend to think, well, how can they leave the workforce that early? Well, the leading edge of baby boomers, in many cases, had corporate pensions. Younger people at the tables asked someone older what those were. Or military pensions. We also underestimate the propensity of people to leave the labor force because of health reasons. We've seen numerous surveys of American workers ask, when do you want to retire? The average response is 67. When do people actually retire? 61. often due to health. Sometimes if you're laid off in your late 50s or 60s, it's extremely difficult to re-enter the workforce. So all of these things contribute to people dropping out. Those big wave of baby boomers dropping out is what drove much of the decline on that sort of right-hand side of that chart. But the feds also know that that doesn't explain all of it. That explains maybe half of the drop or 2/3 of the drop. But there's this unexplained portion of people not in the labor force. And the Fed, we believe, is operating on the belief that if you let wage inflation go, Fed Chair Yellen referred to this as running a high-pressure economy. If you do that, you will draw in some of these sideline workers. And what a win that would be. Because it will slow the rise of wage inflation, so you don't have to worry about the type of runaway inflation that causes the end of cycles, business cycles. And we would grow faster because we'd have a greater percent of our population in the labor force. Why do we believe that that's Fed Chair Yellen's intention and direction, and that's what animates her policy? Because she wrote the definitive economic research paper on this. It's written in 1990. It's called Waiting to Work. She co-authored it with her husband, who is a Nobel laureate, and another researcher whose name no one ever remembers. They always say Yellen and her husband's paper. And what it showed is in all of the cycles following World War II, every time there was a recession, people get laid off, and some of those would drop out of the labor force. The labor force participation rate would go on. And then jobs would come back, but the labor force participation rate stayed low for a while. It was only when wage inflation got going, labor markets were tighter, and wages were higher that people came back in. And that worked every time. But we don't think it's going to work today. And this is a very dangerous statement in the investment industry. I'm a New Englander, so I know it's kind of flat out here, but if we could, if you bear with me with a skiing analogy, what are the most dangerous words in skiing? Follow me, Dad. What are the most dangerous words in investing? This time it's different. So it's with great trepidation we say this time it's different, but we think there are three structural issues in the US labor force that tell us this time it truly is different. In the past, all the cycles that Yellen studied, you can get this paper, it's about 30 pages long, and it is phenomenally boring. I just made my staff read it and summarize it to me, that's much easier. If you look at every cycle, what happened when those workers got laid off? Well, they'd be out of the workforce longer than you would in a growth economy, right? It's recessions. In a growth economy, you're out of the workforce, you're out maybe 5 or 7 weeks. In the recessions that Yellen studied, all the recessions from 1948, start of the data set through 1990, average duration of unemployment in a recession went up. How much? 15 or 20 weeks. And then people got back in the labor force and went back down to sort of 5 or 7 weeks. Where are we today? Well, we got up to not 15 or 20 weeks. We got up to more than 40 weeks. People were out for a long, long time. And even today, with this tight job market, the average duration of unemployment is 25 weeks, higher than the past peaks. This tells us there's something structurally wrong with the US labor force. And some of it started with this long duration of unemployment. The longer you've been out of the workforce, the harder it is to get back in. There are lots of data on that. The longer you're out of the workforce, the more likely you are to drop out of the workforce. And if you've been out, like many workers, for 3, 4, 5 years or more, even if you want to come back in, how likely are you to get back in, to be hired? If you were in the tech industry, your skills are obsolete. If you were in, say, construction or manufacturing or something that required heavy physical labor, it's just that much harder to do the work. We've talked to manufacturers who've tried to bring people in to heavy physical activity, and they just can't do it anymore. They're that much older, and they've been out of it for that much longer. And I think there's a will to work issue as well. If you've been out for 5 years or more, you've already adjusted your lifestyle. There was actually a trend for a while of middle-aged people moving back in with their parents, to the horror of both generations. And that sounds hard, but if you are leaving if you're out that long, you've adjusted. And the thought of setting your alarm for 5 a.m. to go out to a construction work site in a 33-degree drizzle in Chicago is pretty unappealing. But the story gets worse. And we started to clue in on this when we looked at the labor force participation rates of young men. Let me focus on that. That's on the right-hand side. Women are the bottom line, that gray area, 25 to 34-year-old women. They're typically not fully in the labor force because these are child-rearing years. But you can see on this 15-year chart, they're kind of back where they started from. Some dropped out during the recession, they got back in the recovery, and they're kind of just where they've been. But male labor force participation rates for young men have declined and are staying down. They've gone right-hand chart, but the left-hand axis from 93 to 88% or so. Each percentage point is over 200,000 workers. And it turns out that academic studies are now backing up what we've been hearing anecdotally from our business owners for many years. It's the opioid epidemic is having a tremendous impact on the labor force. Drug overdose deaths today have overtaken deaths due to automobile accidents. And in fact, there was a headline yesterday, automobile deaths due to intoxication impairment. It's now more due to drugs than it is alcohol for the first time ever. Other numbers you should think about, it exceeds drug overdose deaths, 2/3 of which are opiate related, exceed the peak deaths due to the peak of the AIDS epidemic in the early 90s. It exceeds homicide, gun homicide deaths by it's 3 times as great, roughly. This is a big deal, and the problem is, that's the gray bars in the chart on the left is overdose deaths, the blue line is automobile deaths. It's rising and rising and rising. And obviously here in Ohio, in southern Ohio, we are very close to the epicenter of this problem, but it is spread nationally. Those people aren't getting back in the labor force anytime soon. The other one related to this, and then we'll kind of wrap it up, is incarceration and recidivism. On the right shows our rates in the United States of incarceration. Look where we are compared to other countries. You have to talk about places like Rwanda to get comparable numbers. I live in a dangerous city in Chicago. I was raised in a dangerous city during the riot years of the 60s. I get it. We need to lock up people. But this system only works if once someone has paid their dues, they have an opportunity to re-engage. How's our track record there? The 5-year recidivism rate in the United States is 76%. In any given year, we let out about 1.25 million people come out of prisons and jails. In any given year, 1 million of them are repeat offenders who go back in. We need about 1.25 million beyond demographic growth and immigration. We need another 1.25 million workers every year to keep this going, this economic expansion going. Think of the waste. The Surgeon General estimates about 10 or 11 million people are using opioids for non-medical reasons. We lose about 1 million people a year back into the jail system for recidivism. We think this will cut short this economic cycle, but not yet. This is when we get to tighter labor markets. What it does mean is we won't get the traditional response. The Fed will be wrong. They won't see a big rise in labor force participation rates. We won't get the final growth spurt due to that. We will get other growth spurts due to higher wages. But it also means that once this cycle gets into those last innings, we have to be very vigilant and prepared for the end of the business cycle. This is how it will end. I wish I had a cheerier message. The good news is we're at least a couple years out from this, but these are the things we'll have to watch. Wage inflation will be a critical component, a critical barometer of starting to watch the clock in this economic cycle. So this is just our observation. This is really for investors. We simply wanted to observe that the latter innings of an economic expansion, you see greater difference in what works for investors and what doesn't work. And we showed in 2012, last time we had a really good sort of global recovery, everything worked, just to different degrees. The only decision you really had to make was, do I take cash out from under the mattress and put it in the markets? But we also observed that we think we are in between the administration's policies and global conditions, and being in this stage of the cycle, that not everything works. We took a look at the election through end of the year performance of those same categories of investments. These are the 12 categories we include in our portfolios, and we noticed there's a lot more differentiation. And although some of that is reversed this calendar year, we think that chart on the right, the post-election experience, probably tells you a lot more, and we'll start reverting to much more challenging environment for bond investors, rising interest rates. We think the U.S. dominance of performance is probably in some ways over. We actually think Europe is overweight in our portfolios right now. Some of that's because they have much more unemployment. It's easier for them to bring workers into their workforces than we have. And it's simply to observe that end-of-cycle behavior is different, and that portfolios have to be managed differently. Morning.
This is the first time in a couple of years that I haven't heard anything about the federal debt burden. In previous breakfasts, there was a lot of fear factor about the effect that was going to have at some point. So what are your thoughts around that?
So it's a great question. It's one I get quite a bit. And again, this goes back to whether I'm wearing my citizen's hat or where I'm wearing my investor's hat, and look at where we are, what we can expect in the next couple of years. Next couple of years, the federal debt is not going to be an important impediment to growth. I know that's a controversial statement. Now, as citizens, we should be scared, very, very scared, right? Long term. Why will it not be so impactful short term? Well, let's start out with just round numbers. The federal debt is about 100% of our GDP, 100% of our national income. I will ask you to think back in your life. Did you have a mortgage and maybe credit card debt that was equal to or greater than 100% of your income at some point in your life? Most people, particularly in areas of really high housing costs, will tell you, oh yeah. What did that mean? Did it stop you from continuing on? No. Did it limit your flexibility to do other things? Ultimately, yes. So carrying debt, and most businesses carry some debt, carrying a debt in of itself is not particularly troubling. What you can't do is what we were doing several years ago, was growing our debt faster than our income, and you can't keep doing that forever. So the risk of debt near term is not very great. We're actually not growing it measurably faster than we're growing GDP. Remember, you have to use the nominal GDP calculation. Your debt is fixed, but we're growing GDP. Yes, 2% in real terms, or 2.5% and 3% we think this year, but you're growing nominal GDP, actual dollars, not real dollars, at about 5% a year, and we're growing our debt at a somewhat slower pace than that, or have been. Some of this will depend on policy going forward. What we do have to recognize, though, is that the path of our debt as a percentage of GDP is not looking very good. In particular, as the baby boomers age and draw upon medical expenses through Medicare, that's the biggest and most troubling component of U.S. debt. But even there, I think some of the fears may be exaggerated. You know, everyone loves to draw straight lines. Medical costs have been going like this, so of course it's easy to project that way in the future. The reality is we're starting to see pushback on medical cost inflation, not so much through the Affordable Care Act, which actually probably stoked inflation in many ways, but more through things like apps that let you shop for medical care. High deductibility plans have been so widely adopted in a short period of time. We've only just started to see the pushback on expenses. As for interest expenses, often brought up, but keep in mind, interest rates tend to go up dramatically only either through higher inflation, which means your nominal GDP, your ability to cover that debt is greater, or through robust growth and real rates going up, that would also mean the debt's more affordable. I believe the administration put out something that said if we could grow at 3%, the debt would actually start declining at a pretty nice clip over time. I think that's a little optimistic. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. As citizens, absolutely we have to worry about it, but from an investment and a business cycle standpoint, it's just not that impactful. Thank you.
Got another question over here.
Yes, as competition heats up for the workforce around in this area, we're seeing wages go incredibly higher. At what point in time and how will that play into inflation?
So it's a great question, and one we're actually trying to look at. You know, the challenge is a lot of past inflation has also been associated with sharp spikes in oil prices that we don't foresee. We think oil is actually in equilibrium now, and with that we won't see that kind of commodity-led inflation. So we're going back and we're looking a lot at sort of the 50s and 60s. What I would say is that that measure of inflation I showed you, that median inflation is running about 3.5%. We can usually go around 4% for a decent clip. Without it causing undue inflation. It's when it gets above that. We are moving towards that 4%. A lot then depends on how much we invest in productivity improvements, which offset that. So if you think of it, 4% labor increases, but if you get up to the U.S. long-term average productivity of 2%, 4% top line, but your workers are 2% more productive, leaves you with 2% net inflation. That's a good rule of thumb. We think that's how the Fed thinks of it as well. So this CapEx will prolong the cycle if it does, as we believe, come forward. But I think we've got probably a good 2 years before we have to worry too much. That 2 years sounds very optimistic, but there are economists out there talking 5 years because of the low levels. And we keep going back to, you're not going to draw sideline workers in. It's going to get tighter faster than you imagine. The traditional ways businesses offset this is they offshore manufacturing. Well, a lot of foreign wages, particularly Chinese wages, have gone up. That's not a great solution anymore. And also, if you're a large company, you're one presidential tweet away from a PR disaster, as a couple of companies have found out. The other way you solve this is through immigration. I have dinner tonight in Chicago with actually the foremost demographics expert on Wall Street, a guy named Dick Hokinson. And my question for Dick is going to be, what's been the impact of illegal immigration? Because we do know that that's drying up with the administration policies, and I don't know how much we've relied on that. Obviously, some, particularly agricultural employment, has been particularly dramatic, and there's probably regional impacts as well. So tight labor is how this cycle will end. There's no doubt about it. How that plays out exactly, it's going to lay out, but we'll be following that wage inflation. When we see it getting up to 4% and staying up there, I think that's when we start the clock ticking.
All right, I believe we have time for one more question right here in the middle.
Building upon that last question, in the construction industry, in the construction business, wages are accelerating at a rapid pace and the competition for workforce is ever growing. But how does that play in with construction and housing? We're in commercial, but the housing market always leading the way and being a leading indicator. But with Trump's upcoming tariffs or additional taxes on lumber coming out of Canada and how that drives inflation. So oil prices may be down, but lumber, which is a huge building material, leading to higher rate of inflation.
That's a great point. And apart from driving CapEx through a more pro-business environment and increasing productivity that way, which is an inflation offset, everything about the administration is inflationary. There's a bias. It doesn't mean it's 1970s inflation. And we've actually talked internally about housing being where we may see that wage inflation first manifests itself. So we have, as you know, a real shortage of homes for sale. We're getting to the point in the single-family market where the baby boomers, the millennials, where everyone thought, every city had their millennial strategy. They're all going to live downtown forever. Well, guess what? getting married and have kids kind of changes that. In urban public schools, we're starting to see the millennials move to the suburbs like every preceding generation. Millennials, as a rule of thumb, while there are certain differences, they kind of do everything that the baby boomers did. They just do it much more slowly. I recently saw an economic paper presented that said some of the behavior of the millennials is driven by how much cheaper and better leisure time is because of better video games. And parents of young men in particular know what I'm talking about. But millennials are getting there. They're moving out, increasing demand on housing at a time we also have extraordinarily low inventory, and now costs are going up between wages and the tariffs on Canadian lumber. It's got to drive prices higher, tougher margins in your business for sure. And I think that could well be how it spreads, right? It's not going to be an oil-led inflation, but it will be housing. What economists broadly classify as shelter is the largest component of core CPI, the exclude food and energy, which are volatile on any given month, and it's what economists tend to look at the short term. It's about 43% of core CPI and 34% of overall CPI. But it's a funny measure. It doesn't actually measure home prices. It measures rents as a part of it, and then they do what's called owner equivalent rent, which is surveys of homeowners saying, what could you sell your house for today? And they look at that, and it's a strange measure. There are reasons that economists like to do it. It's been lagging home prices significantly, but I think it's going to start creeping in. To your point, is very well taken. That may be the inflation measure. It's one of those cases where too much demand chasing too few goods, right? You have limits on how affordable you can make the housing and how fast you can build it because of worker constraints and higher input costs. That's going to be inflationary. It has not yet filtered through to the numbers because of the strange way that we collect that data, but we've been talking actively in my team. So it's a very, very good point, and that'll be another one of the factors we look at very closely. But with that, let me say thank you, and I'll turn it back and appreciate all your time.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Great information there, as always. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you next year. Thanks.